Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes, episode 34. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about why your hospital staff, your OBGYN, or your pediatrician might be giving you bad breastfeeding advice and who you might go to instead. I know this might sound a little bit controversial at first, but it's something I really feel like I need to touch on because so many times I talk to people who have been led astray and they're now 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks in, and their hormones are now shifting from endocrine control, which is when that milk is being controlled automatically, to autocrine control, which needs a driver by that supply and demand programming that we know about. And it's getting critical that they have the right information. And often they have been told inaccurate information from people who don't have the right information themselves. So let's dig in. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I have become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. Many of my clients are surprised by their own self-doubt and anxiety over every baby feeding decision. And in the years that I've been connecting with people during pregnancy and breastfeeding, I've seen time and time again that those anxieties are reduced through hearing from others about their experiences without judgment or fear. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh. I invite you to sit back and listen in to reduce your breastfeeding anxiety through explorations of real-life breastfeeding. So first of all, why is this important? In the United States, we know that most people giving birth report that they would like to breastfeed. 75% initiate breastfeeding. At the 6-month mark, 42% of those people are still breastfeeding, and 13% of those people are exclusively breastfeeding. And so we still have a long ways to go in helping people reach their stated goals. The biggest factor that has been called out as to why this doesn't happen, it's not personal failure, it's not bodies failing people, it's lack of support. And when we look at studies, we see that this lack of support actually comes from lack of training and lack of knowledge from the people that are available in hospitals and pediatric offices. It's really critical for people who are feeding their babies human milk to know that those people that are available to you at hospitals and in your pediatric offices might not be the ones that you want to be getting breastfeeding advice from. So why is this? Well, these people, nursing staff, OBGYNs, even midwives, they are really good at the things they've been trained to do. Providing critical care, helping when you or your baby are sick, providing advice and guidance about milestones throughout the course of your baby's life, especially when I'm talking about your pediatrician. But these people have not been trained in breastfeeding. And when I tell this to people, it is often quite surprising. Pediatricians receive 3 hours of breastfeeding training in medical school. 3 total hours. In contrast, IBCLCs must have 90 hours of lactation-specific training, and then an additional 5 hours of communication-specific training. And often we choose to have that additional 5 hours be somehow related to lactation. So we select 5 hours of training that has to do with communication within lactation. So often it might be cultural competence within the field of lactation, for instance. And then we're also required to have 14 college level hours of science education. So that would include a college level statistics course, a college level nutrition class, a college level child development or human development course before we are able to sit for the board exam, which tests our knowledge on lactation and development. So pediatricians receive those 3 hours. Similarly, the nursing staff that is in the hospital, their base training is anywhere between 2 and 3 individual classes that they would take in nursing school that might cover breastfeeding. That's not enough knowledge to be able to then competently and confidently support people who want to feed their babies and all the problems that might arise during that time. There are studies that show that when they ask doctors, nurses, OBGYNs, pediatricians, both residents and those that are fully through the residency process about lactation, that often they don't know about the physiology of lactation. They don't know all of the benefits. They might cite 1 or 2, like they might cite an immunological benefit, or they might cite that it's good for bonding, or they might cite that, they think it's cheaper, but they aren't actually able to paint a picture of why breastfeeding is important. They aren't able to name the problems that might arise, and they aren't actually able to name the physiological process of breastfeeding. Do you love to read about pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding? Are you looking for books to help you become a more confident parent? Or perhaps books to help you understand what went wrong with your breastfeeding journey or to do better next time with breastfeeding? Or do your kids have questions about breastfeeding or pregnancy, but you don't really know how to answer them? Would you prefer to have a curated list on these topics? Go to the link in the show notes to my new affiliated bookshop. Every purchase you make benefits the Milk Making Minutes. But better than that, these books are vetted. I've read them all, and I feel very confident recommending them to you. I'll be adding to them continuously, so go to that link when you want to purchase a book. It will help the show, and you can feel confident it will be a purchase you will enjoy. I started the Milk Making Minutes because I'm passionate about supporting breastfeeding people. But more importantly, I knew that hearing real people tell real stories would benefit both the storytellers and the listeners. I had this idea for 3 years before I launched. I asked so many people how I should begin, and Anchor came up repeatedly as the easiest way to launch a podcast. And I have not been disappointed. If you are passionate about a topic and have wanted to start a podcast, you can use Anchor to record and distribute your podcast. It's easy to use. You can use the editing tools right from the platform. You can distribute your podcast episodes seamlessly to listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from Anchor. And the best part is, it's free. And the tech support has been great too. Go to anchor.fm or download the app right to your phone to get started on your great podcast idea. So why is this important to know? Well, often I have people coming to me saying that the nurses and the staff told them only feed the baby every 2 to 3 hours. Well, we know that sometimes babies have the suck reflex more often than every 2 to 3 hours, and that is part of the physiological process of getting your milk to come in. And so if the parent is limiting the baby to every 2 to 3 hours for nursing, that is going to limit your hormonal response to breastfeeding. And it might be that you have less milk that comes in, and then that leads to weight gain problems, and then that begins that early supplementation cycle. I often hear things like you should only nurse on each side for a certain amount of time, and that is wrong. Babies have a wide range of the amount of time that they nurse on a side. And so really we know that we should be cueing into the baby and what the baby is telling us that they need. We also hear things like, don't let the baby use you as a pacifier. Again, that is part of the baby's physiological, biological, instinctual way of bringing the milk in. So if the baby is not able to use the mom, quote unquote, as a pacifier for that non-nutritive sucking, then the milk might be less likely to come in. And then once this starts and the formula supplementation begins, based on nurse and other provider attitudes towards breastfeeding, it becomes way harder to actually exclusively breastfeed. We also know that if doctors, nurses are not trained in all of the problems that might arise, if they don't know fully how to treat for thrush, if they don't know fully how to treat for mastitis, then it might take way longer to identify these problems and to fully treat them. And then that can lead to a reduction in breastfeeding or an early cessation in breastfeeding because there's only so much pain or frustration that a parent can take when they're in those early postpartum days. We often hear lots of incorrect pumping advice given. Often I'll see in the hospital that wrong phalange sizes are told to be used. We often see people coming out of the hospital using size 28 phalanges, and many lactation consultants, I'll do an episode on this in the future, but many lactation consultants are seeing that most people that we are seeing need to actually be in size 13 to size 17 millimeter phalanges, not one of the size 24 or 28 millimeter phalanges. And using a wrong phalange size can then lead to reduced output, more pain while breastfeeding. So again, when attitudes towards breastfeeding are not where they should be, that then impacts the breastfeeding family, it impacts the baby. When wrong advice is given out, it brings more frustration. And so what can you do? Lean into your intuition. If you're hearing something and it sounds off, trust that. And then reach out to somebody who you know is going to give you solid breastfeeding advice and isn't going to lead you astray and give you advice based on their own biases, but based on what they know about breastfeeding, combined with what you know about the baby that you have in front of you. Because you are the expert in your baby and that person is the expert on physiological breastfeeding. It's always good to be in touch with a private practice IBCLC before giving birth. Talk to a few so that you know who it is that you're going to call on if and when problems arise. That way it doesn't become an emergency situation. Secondly, join support groups that are based on providing evidence-based breastfeeding information. These are groups such as Breastfeeding USA and La Leche League International. These groups are known to have solid evidence-based breastfeeding information. You can find groups like this online, and you can join local chapters as well, both online and in person. The people who lead these groups have been highly trained to not only provide breastfeeding advice, but they have to continue their training as well. So they'll always be up to date on the latest protocols. So I hope that this gives you some food for thought to know that you are not crazy. If you are hearing advice that sounds wrong from hospital staff or from your medical providers outside of hospital staff, it's probably because they are not trained on breastfeeding. They are highly skilled in many things, but breastfeeding is probably not one of them. So one of the things that you can do is, if they are giving you breastfeeding advice, you can say, what is your breastfeeding education? What breastfeeding training have you had? Can you tell me about that? Because this doesn't seem right to me based on the information that I have researched, and I want to know that I can trust what you're telling me. And then if they don't have much to tell you about it, or if they're telling you based on their own experiences, you can know that it might be wrong. If you would like to join a community of people who are talking about these types of things, who would like to make change in the breastfeeding community, please join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. That's where we're having longer and deeper conversations about this. Please share this episode with a friend who might be struggling with the advice they're getting from a person in the medical community who might not be trained in breastfeeding. We'll be back in a few days with another amazing episode from somebody sharing their breastfeeding story.